Tipping is out of control. I'm just gonna say it. Today, we're expected to tip so much more than we used to be for various different kinds of services and oftentimes for larger amounts. I remember when I was a kid, it seemed like 15% was the standard tip for good service. And now it's a minimum of 20% if you don't want to offend your server, even if the service isn't good. And what's wild is we're expected to tip more now on top of really crazy inflation that we've already had. So not only does everything cost more, but everyone expects a tip. Where do we draw the line? And people are sick of it. Studies and reports are showing that more and more people are just hitting no on the little iPad. So let's get into it today. Has tipping culture gone too far? When should you tip and when should you draw the line? And who is to blame here for this new tipping culture that we have? Before we get into it, I want to thank the sponsor of this video, which is BetterHelp. Shout out to BetterHelp because they're the first sponsor of the commentary series. And I have actually used BetterHelp myself, so I can speak to it a little bit. If you've never heard of BetterHelp, are you living under a rock? Because they sponsor a ton of YouTubers and podcasts. If you've never heard of BetterHelp, it's a service that connects you to licensed therapists that are trained to give you helpful, unbiased advice. I used it after I had jaw surgery because I had a really hard time accepting how my face looked. It was really weird looking for like a full year after that, and it was so hard to deal with because everyone I talked to in real life was like, oh, you look the same. Oh, it looks fine. And I was like, nobody understands. It was just difficult because I feel like nobody got it. So talking to somebody who was unbiased and also trained in how to talk about these things was very helpful because I feel like my friends and family thought they were helping, but like it wasn't always helpful. I've also dealt with anxiety before, especially around like big life decisions, like moving, things like that. I like to have an unbiased opinion. I just really like that. I find BetterHelp useful for that sort of thing. If you are struggling right now with anxiety or depression, I really feel for you because it's very difficult in those moments to even remember what it's like to not feel that. It can be very overwhelming, but you can get help. And the awesome thing now is there's really like no stigma anymore, and it's easier than ever to get access to therapy. Like we can do it from the comfort of our homes now, which is really awesome. Especially with BetterHelp, if you want, you can start with just the messaging. You can do phone calls or video calls, whatever you're really comfortable with. If you want to get started, you can use my link. It's betterhelp.com/church. I'll have it linked down below. You're going to answer a few questions, and then BetterHelp is going to match you with a therapist that has experience with what you're dealing with and has been helping people for years with similar things to you. If you want to let BetterHelp connect you with a therapist that can support you from the comfort of your own home, check out the link below or go to betterhelp.com/church. You can get a special discount on your first month when you use my link or when signing up if you select me as your referral. So thank you to BetterHelp for sponsoring, and now on to tipping culture. Who's to blame? Okay, because I figured it out, you guys. It's Square. That's right, the company that makes the little iPad that swivels around. Square, if you're not familiar, is the point of sale iPad that a lot of companies use now to process transactions. And it is really convenient. You can tap to pay and you can add a tip, which is a cool feature if you don't have cash. However, Square has enabled pretty much every business to just add on a little tip feature. We're being asked to tip places where things are just thrown in a microwave and warmed up. Not just coffee shops and restaurants, but all kinds of places, gift shops, gas stations, I've heard. I really think it's because of that little iPad. We're kind of conditioned now when we see the option for that, we feel like we should tip. Whereas before that point of sale service, you know, these businesses could add a little tip jar, but it was less common for people to actually put stuff in it. You know, maybe if it was like really exceptional service, but for whatever reason, the iPad makes people think, oh, I'm supposed to tip here, aren't I? Or am I? Do I have to? I don't know. A lot of us know now when we go in somewhere and we see that little iPad, it's gonna ask you a few questions and it's kind of awkward. It's a lot like this TikTok.
Enter your card and it'll ask you just a few little prompts here.
Okay. Okay.
This one just cracks me up because sometimes it really does feel like that. I have heard that people at the register can't actually see what you put when you're done, but there are times where I swear they're just like hovering just to like see if you press anything. So awkward. And while tipping historically has been a way to reward really good service, I think now what it's turned into is just a way for employers to get away with paying their staff less and having them kind of survive off tips. There are a lot of states in America where if tips are accepted, they don't have to pay the minimum wage to servers. Not in California, that's not the case. There's a lot of states where people make $2, $3 an hour are tipping culture. So it now feels more like an obligation on the consumer to compensate for the restaurant not paying their staff as well. And there is the argument that if they eliminated tipping, they would have to raise prices at restaurants. And I say, I'm down for that. There are a few restaurants in LA that do that already. One of them, Kazunori, one of my favorite sushi restaurants in LA, they have a 16% service charge and they say no tipping. There's no line to tip. It's just built into your bill. And it's just nice. I honestly like it a lot. You don't have to do the math. It's like just simple. They're not expecting a crazy amount either. Like 16% is less than what I would have tipped actually. Unless everyone is doing it, it would hurt that restaurant because their prices would look higher when they're really about the same at the end of the day. But the psychology of it all, people look at the menu price and forget about the tip until later. So it wouldn't really work unless everybody did it. I'm sure as all of us know, and this is really the case for a lot of my commentary videos, this is mainly a US thing. This isn't really that big in Europe. Growing up, I heard that it was rude to tip in Europe. Like, you do not do that. The people make a living wage, and if you try and tip them, it's offensive. I think now I've heard that it is a little bit different. I think, they'll accept a small tip more often, but it's not like in the US where they're asking for a tip everywhere and they're asking for 20% or more. It's more like 10%. And a lot of countries in Europe, if you just didn't tip at all, they wouldn't think anything of it, which is so wild to us. So why don't they tip in other places? Well, the most common answer is because they already get a living wage. In the US, it's legal in a lot of states to just not pay servers minimum wage if they're able to accept tips. Whereas in Europe, they're always paying them more of a living wage. Historically in Europe, they haven't really needed the tips to live their life. So today we're asked to tip more than ever for various different things, and I wanted to go through my list that I've made of when I think you should tip and when I don't think that you have to, and when maybe you should but you don't really have to. This is what I think you should have to tip for. Restaurants, valet, also Postmates and Uber Eats. You should tip those people because they don't make that much. This is what you should not have to tip for. Picking up to-go food. A lot of times you don't even interact with anyone in the store. You just grab it off a shelf. Anything where you have to provide the tip before you get the service. So if you're paying at a cashier and they're asking you to tip, but you don't get the service until 20 minutes later. I even saw one girl got asked to tip on her massage before she got a massage. Retail stores. In my video about the wedding industry, it came to my attention that there are some wedding dress shops that ask for a tip. No, I think anything retail, just bake it into the price. Anything where it is an owner operator setting their own price. For example, a hairstylist that has their own little salon. I don't think they should be asking for the tip because they can just bake it into the cost. If it's a hairstylist that works at like a Supercuts or something, they're paid an hourly wage that they do not set, you should tip them. Anywhere where the food is just pre-prepared and you're basically just being asked to tip a cashier, I don't think you need to tip that. Anything medical. I was asked to tip last time I got Botox, and no, I didn't. I made a whole TikTok about it, and a lot of nurses commented saying that is messed up, so most people stood with me on that one. Even Ubers, I don't think you really need to tip for Ubers unless they're like helping you with your luggage or something. Another new thing we've seen in the tipping industry is these billion-dollar corporations enabling a tip feature. Okay, so it really used to be if a local coffee shop had a tip jar, like no one thought anything of it because you're supporting the local coffee shop. I feel like it was when Starbucks added the tip feature that we were all like, whoa. What's going on here? They can probably afford to pay people a little bit more. Now, I don't know. I don't know the financials of their business. Starbucks last year made $1 billion, so they could probably afford to pay people. We also see places like Subway is now notorious for asking for a tip. A lot of these places want a 20% tip when you're not getting like a sit-down restaurant service. A lot of times I order Chipotle online and they also ask for a tip. This is just another one. When the billion-dollar companies jumped on board, I feel like that's when people were like, no, this is too far. I would argue that these billion-dollar companies, they can afford to pay the employees more, but they're seeing it as an opportunity to get a little more out of the customers so that they don't have to. I think the thing is they found it's harder to retain employees. Like, people don't want to work at a Starbucks anymore. And for these companies, I think just enabling the tip option was a way to maybe try and keep them, because people could earn a little bit more without the company actually having to pay a whole lot more. So one thing I don't think I've really heard people talk about is how I think that tipping can backfire on the companies when they go too far with this. So I've had a few circumstances where the tipping just made me feel so uncomfortable that I never went back to that place. So one example, I once went to this food truck. This was on a trip in Alaska, so I never went back there because obviously I'm never in Alaska. But if I lived in the same town as this place, I would never go back either. So at this food truck, you just ordered at the cashier as you do with a food truck. And right after, she said to you very loudly, would you like to leave a tip? Like, very loud, yelling it for everyone to hear. Like, it was comical, actually. So of course, everyone said yes. And she'd be like, how much? Like, making sure that everybody heard that. I honestly thought it was so funny. I had never seen that before. I was kind of like, props to this girl. She's gonna get a ton of tips, but also so awkward. If I knew a place was going to yell very loudly asking if I want a tip or not, I would not go there. I think a lot of people, they genuinely are fine with tipping for good service, but they don't like the obligation to tip on everything, whether it's good service or not. With a food truck, really, are you getting service? I mean, a food truck is kind of a questionable one. I don't know if most people tip on food trucks, but I feel like it's similar to a coffee shop. Most people probably aren't tipping that much or anything at all if they're going to a food truck, just if I were to guess. In that case, if I lived in the same town as that food truck, I just wouldn't go back because I don't like feeling obligated to in that kind of situation. Like, it just felt like everyone was pressured into it. And there's actually a store in Seattle, an ice cream shop called Molly Moon's, and they noticed that the tipping screen was making customers uncomfortable, so they took it out. Just take a look.
Owner Molly Moon Neitzel says those checkout screens made customers and her workers uncomfortable.
Employees don't really want to stand there and think about how much influence you have over what they're going to take home.
So she raised prices and raised pay.
What's your minimum wage here?
We start folks at $21 an hour.
It does take away from the customer experience when you have to go through that awkward, do I tip for this or not? It just makes you feel a little weird about that business in general. Things like ice cream, it's like, just charge a little bit more for it, and that's what they decided to do. Another instance where this backfired is when I was getting my hair done. I went to this girl that I had gone to many times before, but for whatever reason, her prices were much higher this time. I also bought some product and the subtotal was $600. And keep in mind, this is an owner-operated, just little boutique salon. Just this girl who owns her own little chair within like one of those Phoenix suite salons, so it's not super expensive. And I bought some shampoo and conditioner. So it was asking me to tip on the total, including the shampoo and conditioner. And I was honestly taken aback that it was $600 because this was in Seattle and normally getting your hair done there is not that expensive. Like, that's more of LA prices, and I don't even pay that much in LA. I thought, okay, does this include the tip because she owns her own business? And I felt so awkward, so I asked her, like, oh, do people normally still tip, or how does it work? And she just deflected the question, like, whatever makes you comfortable, And I was like, this is just really uncomfortable, so I didn't know what to do. So I just tipped the 20% and I never went back. Because now my total was over $700 for like some balayage or whatever. Now, where I get my hair done in LA, it's usually about $400. Okay, blonde hair is still expensive, so, it's time consuming. It takes like 3 or 4 hours. And this girl is really good. But she charges me about $400, and she says the tip is included. You don't have to tip on top of that, which I very much appreciate, and she has earned my service again and again and again because I like how she's transparent about it. She does a good job. She owns her own business, so she can bake in the tip to that price. And so I support her business because I like the way that she runs it. And honestly, she does a way better job. But the point is, I think a lot of businesses don't realize that if you're going too far with making your customers feel uncomfortable with your tipping practices, they're not going to come back because not everywhere is doing that. And same thing when I was asked to tip for Botox. I'm not going back to that place. I just think that's ridiculous because I know that most places do not ask for a tip on Botox because it's considered a medical thing. You're not supposed to tip on medical stuff. Like, it's just weird. I just think it's something for businesses to keep in mind. It makes customers uncomfortable. Just be transparent about it.
Tipping culture is not out of control. You guys are just assholes, which is what I used to think until my parents were visiting me and their air conditioning broke. So I drive my dad over to pick up the car. He's like, I literally just paid, I don't know, $500 to have my car fixed. And then the guy swivels at the car mechanic, swivels the screen around and is like, you want to tip 20%, 25%, 30%. And he's like, I never don't push a button for a percentage to tip, but I didn't tip. Are we tipping car mechanics now? And I was like, no.
You set your own prices, just set it to what you want to be paid. Don't ask for a tip. It's so weird. Another thing that I've noticed is the standard of tipping has gone up over time. I swear when I was a kid, it was like 15% is what people said the standard was to tip. Does anyone else remember that? Is this like Mandela effect? I don't know. I feel like when I was younger, this is before I was the age to pay for things and actually tip myself. I feel like people just said 15%. And then I don't know when it just became 20%. 20% is standard. It kind of feels like 15% is actually rude. So it begs the question, when will it become 25%? 30%. I feel like it could happen.
Thank you so much for your purchase. I'm just going to spin this iPad around. Sure.
I have been to restaurants or bars where they have one of those mini iPads, like one of these, and it will have 3 amounts that you can choose from, and they pre-select the highest one, and it'll be 30%. They think you're not gonna notice. I'm like, and I hate to say that because, there are times where I have tipped 30% because the service was really good. But there's just something that rubs me the wrong way about them pressing it and then expecting you to just not notice and pay the 30% tip. No. It's always the people who don't even give good service that are pre-selecting it like that too. Another thing I've noticed more recently is places automatically adding in a service charge but still having a line to tip. So I went to Joshua Tree recently, and both of the restaurants that we went to added a 20% service charge, but they still had a line to tip. It would honestly be easy in some cases to miss that service charge and not even notice it and then still tip. Luckily, my friend Lauren did notice it, but again, it made it awkward because we were like, is this the tip? What is this for? Are we still supposed to tip on top of it? What's going on? If I have to ask the server what it is, that's awkward. Again, that's putting me in that situation where I'm like, ooh, I kind of don't want to come back here because they make it weird. I think it's totally fine to have the service charge and to just include the tip like that, but be upfront about it. The server needs to say, hey, just so you know, the tip is included. Or so you don't need to tip any more than that if you don't want to. But they act sus about it. They're hoping that you don't notice and you accidentally tip more, so then they get a 40% tip. I really feel like that's sometimes what they do. But again, there are restaurants that do this well. Kazunori, they just include the service charge. There's no line to tip. They say that is the tip. That's how you should do it if you're going to include the service charge. Don't make us feel like we need to tip more on top of that if you're including the tip. Calling it a service charge is confusing because it's is that the tip or not? I don't know. And now I feel weird about it. Something I think is kind of funny with tipping culture is in America, we don't notice how nuanced it is until a European comes here. Europeans trying to understand how we tip is kind of hilarious because in Europe, you don't often have to tip that much. So they're a little bit like, wait, how does it work? Just take a look at this Reddit post. It's pretty funny. This guy says, I go into a local bakery to have a coffee and some pastries for breakfast. The bill is $6. Do I hand the server a tenner and tell them to please give me back $2? So the tip is $2. What if I pay by credit card? It's like, do not worry. If you're paying by credit card, you will have the option to tip. Do not worry about that. I spend a full night in a bar having lunch, beers, 5 in total. Do I pay and tip after each beer? And obviously we know like you would just pay and tip at the end usually if you just have a tab open. But it's just funny how we don't even notice like, oh, you do kind of tip different amounts for coffee, for if a bar or a restaurant. I think one of the biggest problems people have with tipping culture now is that we really feel guilted into it.
Am I obligated to tip at a restaurant when I place a to-go order?
This is kind of middle ground here on the to-go order. Dining in, I'm outrageously tipping. Valets, I'm outrageously tipping. Tipping at a fast food joint? No. Tipping at the Starbucks line? No. This one, I'm kind of going to be 50-50. One is I don't want to be guilted into anything. I'm with you. B, almost never have I regretted being generous. There's very few times I look back, unless I was guilted into it, because they're in there working and I'm doing well. God's blessed me. Why not? I do resent this spin thing at the counter, and that is guilting. I'm not doing that.
A lot of times, I think we genuinely would love to give a tip, especially if you have good service. We just don't want to feel like obligated to for everything. The Square iPad it makes you feel like a cheapskate if you don't tip, even for things where it's not even really a service. Like when they're just going and grabbing a croissant and it's asking for a tip. I think it's all about the UI of Square, the way that they present 3 tipping options as larger than the no tip button, and just the fact that you have to go out of your way to press no tip. I know like most people here have tipped for something before, just out of social obligation because someone was maybe looking over at the screen and you didn't really want to because like, quite frankly, there wasn't really a service being provided. I mean in terms of they're just grabbing something and handing it to you. In my opinion, that is not something that's worthy of a tip. That's just what the job is. But I do think sometimes, coffee baristas at a local coffee shop, like there's some skill to that. At least with a barista, they're making the coffee. Like they're making espresso shots and maybe some latte art. Like they are doing more of a service than just grabbing something pre-made and giving it to you. But now these Square machines, I swear, make us feel like a cheapskate if you're not tipping when there is a tip option. Something about it. I think it's because quite often the pre-selected option is to tip and you have to go out of your way to hit other and type in 0 or to hit no tip. It makes you feel like you're expected to tip even when, again, not really a service being provided. Because I'm all for tipping when there's a service, like a sit-down restaurant or even a coffee shop, like a local coffee shop. Okay, so the thing with tipping is that the more that we do it for various different things, the more we reinforce companies being able to just pay low wages. Like, think about it. If tipping was never a thing, people just would not do those jobs. And then the employers would be forced to just pay a better wage. Would the prices go up? Probably a little bit, but I think it would be less than you expect. Another issue I have with tipping today is that Square is taking a percentage of those tips. A lot of times, if you're not tipping in cash, you probably wonder, who is getting this money? Is it the business owner? Are they really distributing it to the staff? Like, where is it going? And one thing I do know is that if it's through one of the little iPads, Square is taking a cut.
Back when Molly Moons accepted tips, she says the biggest winners were credit card processors.
Because they make more on the credit card processing fees.
Very small cut. It's a payment processing fee of like 2 or 3% of the total transaction, but that does include the tip. When you think about how many companies use Square, Square is probably making like over $1 million off of tips. Other people's tips a year. But a lot of times I do wonder, like, is this going to the restaurant owner? Like, how are they making sure it's going to the right person? Like, if you want to tip, really the best is always to just tip in cash. I have heard of cases where the business owner is taking a cut of those tips and distributing it out amongst people, and not always in an even way. Another issue that I have with making people rely on tips is that there is some inequality in how people tip. We would be ignorant to think there aren't aren't some messed up people out there tipping certain people better based on their race, gender, how they look. It's messed up, but there's definitely people out there that are doing that. Even pretty privilege comes into play here. Like, I made that whole video about pretty privilege. I do think more attractive people probably get better tips because they have that halo effect. But also the New York Times found that Black women who were tipped restaurant workers earned on average $5 an hour less than their white male counterparts nationwide. And Molly Moon's that ice cream shop even found this to be true for their shop.
And she says the data from the very system that collected the tips showed they led to pay inequities.
Black employees at Molly Moon's were making a lot less than white employees.
You can tell
tips.
that?
Absolutely.
I do think people should be paid different amounts based on how their service is, but definitely not on how they look. But like, you know, there are people out there that do this, maybe even subconsciously. They might not realize they're doing it, but they're doing it. So this has been a lot of hating on tipping and hating on the point of sale systems, but the one thing I do actually like about it is I never have cash with me anymore. And, you know, when I do want to tip, it's easier to. There have been times in the past where I literally had to go to an ATM to tip, and that's way more annoying than the iPad system. So at least the iPad system does make it easier for when we do want to tip. Because I feel like now you guys probably think I'm a cheapskate. Like, no, I do tip like 20% minimum when I go to restaurants, and I tip at a lot of coffee shops I go to. I do tip, and I'll tip well on things that are an actual service. But when it's not actually a service, I've been putting my foot down, even if it's a little bit awkward, because it's just like, what? Will tipping ever go away? I honestly don't think so. I think it's too far gone. I don't think it's ever gonna go away. It's fine how it is at restaurants and even coffee shops, but like, it's just gotta stop with like the Botox, with like retail stores. No. I've even seen some people be asked to tip on online orders. You guys, I can't with that. I think we all have recognized it has just gone a little bit too far. Okay, but let me know, what do you guys think? If you work in a coffee shop or a restaurant or anything like that right now, like, what is your experience with people tipping? Are people still tipping a lot, or do you notice the tipping fatigue? How do you guys tip? Where do you draw the line with tipping? So thank you guys for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.